The first thing I did was throw the box toward the trash pile. It landed with a dull thud in the corner of the attic. "About time," I muttered. "You've taken up enough space." I'd been clearing out the attic for nearly 3 hours, surrounded by 40 years' worth of things that had somehow become too sentimental to throw away and too forgotten to remember. Old lamps, Christmas decorations, boxes of school papers from my teaching days. The realtor was coming the following week, and if I was finally going to sell the house, I couldn't keep pretending every dusty box held a reason to stay. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and reached for the next stack. Then something caught my eye. A photograph had slipped out of the box I'd just tossed aside. I bent down with a groan. Let's see who wanted one last look. It was Margaret. She was standing in our backyard, laughing at something outside the frame, her gardening gloves covered in dirt. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. "You always hated having your picture taken." The attic suddenly felt quieter. 15 years. That's how long she'd been gone. Some days it felt like yesterday. Other days, it felt like someone else's life. I picked up the box again. "Fine," I sighed. "One more minute." Inside were photo albums, greeting cards, and several envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. I don't remember putting these here. I set them aside. Beneath them was a small cassette tape. Gray, plain, no music label. No date, just handwriting. At first I only recognized the writing, then I recognized whose it was. Margaret. My fingers tightened around the cassette. "No," I whispered it before I'd even read a single word. After 60 years of marriage, I'd seen her handwriting on grocery lists, birthday cards, recipes, and little notes she'd hide in my lunchbox when I was still teaching. I would have known those letters anywhere. Slowly, I turned the cassette over. Written across the front were 7 words. "For Tom." My heart skipped, then my eyes dropped to the line beneath it. "Please don't listen until you're ready to forgive yourself." Everything inside me went still. What? I read it again, then again. Forgive myself? I looked around the empty attic as if someone might explain it. For what? The question echoed louder than I intended. Rain rattled against the roof. The old house answered with silence. I sat down on an unopened box because my knees suddenly didn't feel trustworthy anymore. Margaret had been gone 15 years. Cancer had taken her slowly, but even in her final days, she never stopped worrying about everyone except herself. She'd squeezed my hand in the hospital and smiled. "You'll be all right, Tom. I don't want to be all right without you. You won't have a choice." She'd been right about that. She was right about most things. But this made no sense. Forgive myself. Those words circled my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. Had she blamed me for something? Had I missed something? Or had she known a truth I'd never discovered? I searched the box again. Photographs, letters, nothing explaining the cassette. No date, no instructions, just those impossible words. I slipped one of the envelopes open, hoping for an answer. It was empty. Another, empty, a third, also empty. Who packs empty envelopes? I frowned. Margaret never did anything without a reason. That was one of the first things I loved about her. Everything had a purpose. Every drawer, every recipe card, every family tradition. If she'd hidden this cassette, she wanted me to find it. But why now? Why after all these years? Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 3 times. I realized I'd been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the tape as though it might suddenly explain itself. Instead, it only seemed heavier, almost alive. I laughed nervously. "Listen to yourself, Tom. It's just an old cassette." But it wasn't. Not anymore. It was Margaret's voice. waiting patiently for 15 years. The problem was, I didn't own a cassette player anymore. I almost drove into town that very afternoon to find one. I even picked up my car keys. Then, I stopped halfway to the front door. What if I don't like what I hear? The question hit harder than I expected. What if the tape wasn't filled with love? What if it was an apology? Or a confession? Or worse, a truth she'd protected me from my entire life? For the first time since her funeral, I was afraid of hearing my wife's voice. I carried the cassette into my study downstairs. The desk she'd given me on my 65th birthday still stood beside the window. I opened the top drawer. The tape rested in my hand for another long moment. I'm not ready. The words surprised me because they were true. Not ready to hear her. Not ready to remember. Not ready to discover what she believed I needed to forgive. I placed the cassette inside the drawer and quietly closed it. The click of the wood sounded strangely final, as though the house itself had just accepted a secret neither of us was prepared to uncover. I had no way of knowing that hiding the tape for one more night would become the biggest mistake I'd made since the day I lost Margaret. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cassette sitting inside my desk drawer, waiting as patiently as if Margaret herself knew I couldn't ignore it forever. By morning, I had made exactly one decision. I wasn't going to open the drawer. At least, that was the plan. Around 10 o'clock, the front door opened without a knock. "Grandpa?" "I'm in the kitchen." Emily walked in carrying 2 grocery bags. I brought food. I was surviving just fine. She looked at the empty counter. "Coffee isn't a food group. It keeps me alive. So does actual food." I chuckled, but she didn't. Instead, she studied me. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. That's the fastest you've ever answered that question. I'm just tired. You look worried. I've had a busy week." She folded her arms. "You've cleaned the attic before. It never made you look like you forgot how to smile." I looked away. "You notice too much." I learned from Grandma. That sentence landed harder than she realized. Emily unpacked the groceries in silence before speaking again. "Did you find something up there?" I hesitated just a second too long. "You did, just old memories. Good memories or bad ones? I haven't figured that out yet." She walked closer. "Grandpa, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it by yourself." I almost told her. I almost reached into the drawer and handed her the cassette. Instead, I smiled. "I'm fine." She sighed. "I don't believe you. I know." After lunch, she glanced around my study. "You still have that old record player? It stopped working years ago." "What about a cassette player?" I froze. "What made you ask that?" She shrugged. "I found a box of old tapes at a thrift store yesterday. It reminded me nobody owns cassette players anymore." I tried to sound casual. "I suppose they aren't easy to find. We could probably find one." "I don't need one." She narrowed her eyes. "Grandpa, what?" "You definitely need one." I laughed nervously. "What makes you think that?" "Because you never ask random questions unless you're trying to hide the real one." She knew me far too well. So, I cleared my throat. "If we happen to see one while we're out, I suppose it wouldn't hurt." She grinned. I knew it. Within an hour, we were driving through town. The first antique shop smelled like old books and furniture polish. Emily wandered toward vintage cameras while I searched every shelf. Nothing. The second store had radios, typewriters, and vinyl records. Still nothing. "You look disappointed," Emily said. "I guess I was hoping we'd get lucky." She smiled. One more place. The third shop was smaller than the others. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter. "Looking for anything special?" Emily answered before I could. "A cassette player." He pointed toward the back shelf. I think there's one back there. I felt my heartbeat quicken. It was dusty, scratched, missing one rubber foot, but it looked intact. You want to test it? The owner asked. Please, he plugged it into the wall. The machine hummed softly. It works. Emily looked at me. Looks like today is your lucky day. Lucky, I wasn't sure that was the word. On the drive home, I couldn't stop staring at the paper bag resting on the passenger seat. Emily finally broke the silence. Were you and Grandma into music? Every Saturday night. Dancing? Even when we were too tired. She smiled. What was her favorite song? Unforgettable. That's fitting. It was. For a moment I wasn't driving through Vermont anymore. I was 25 again. Margaret was laughing barefoot in our living room while dinner burned in the kitchen because we were too busy dancing. You missed the smoke alarm, she'd laughed. I was distracted. By what? You, even after 60 years, she never stopped making me feel like the luckiest man alive. Until cancer arrived. The memories changed. Hospital rooms, machines, quiet conversations at midnight. Doctors who spoke gently because there wasn't anything gentle left to say. One night I'd whispered, I'm sorry. She squeezed my hand. For what? I should have gotten you here sooner. She smiled that same calm smile. Oh, Tom, if I'd noticed earlier, you would have loved me exactly the same. I failed you. You loved me. It wasn't enough. It always was. Those had been some of the last real words we shared. Yet I had never believed them. Not completely. Back home, Emily carried the groceries inside. I'll see you Sunday? I'll be here. You promise you're okay? I promise. She hugged me tightly. I love you. I love you too. When her car disappeared down the driveway, the silence returned. Only this time, it wasn't empty. The cassette player sat on the dining room table. Beside it, the tape. I stood there for nearly an hour. Finally, I picked it up. All right, Margaret. My hands shook as I slid the cassette into the player. The machine clicked. I closed my eyes. Then, a soft crackle, static, and suddenly, her voice. Hello, my sweet Tom. Every breath left my body. I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. I don't know when you'll hear this. Maybe next year. Maybe long after I'm gone. Tears blurred my vision. If you're listening, it means you finally found what I hid. I covered my mouth. It was her. Exactly as I remembered. Gentle, warm, alive, she laughed softly. I hope you're still making terrible coffee. Despite everything, I laughed through my tears. I also hope you've forgiven yourself for overwatering my roses. Another laugh escaped me. You always believed you had to fix everything, she continued. But Tom, you gave me a beautiful life. 60 wonderful years. Thank you for every dance, every road trip, every quiet morning, and every ordinary day that somehow became extraordinary because we shared it. I whispered, I miss you. Then her voice changed. Softer, more serious. Tom, the room felt colder. There are things I chose never to tell you while I was alive. I leaned closer. My heart pounded. I'm ready, I whispered. Please, tell me. There was a loud click. Static filled the room. Then, nothing, the tape had stopped. I stared at the machine in disbelief. No, I pressed play again. Only static. I rewound it, played it again. The same thing. The message ended at exactly the moment everything was about to change. I looked at the silent cassette. One question echoed through my mind. Had time destroyed the rest of Margaret's final words, or had someone made sure I would never hear them? I must have played the cassette 20 times that night. Every time it ended in the same place. There are things I chose never to tell you while I was alive. Click, Static, silence, no. I whispered it every single time, as though the tape might suddenly decide to continue. By sunrise, I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was hunting them. Margaret had never done anything without a reason. If she'd hidden one tape, maybe she'd hidden something else. I walked into our bedroom and stopped in front of her sewing cabinet. It hadn't been opened in years. I rested my hand on the wooden handle. "I hope you don't mind, Maggie." I still called her Maggie when nobody was around. She always smiled when I did. The top drawer held exactly what I expected. Thread, buttons, needles organized inside tiny glass jars. The second drawer held unfinished quilting squares. I picked one up. "Emily was supposed to help you finish this." My voice caught. "You never got the chance." I carefully placed it back. Then I noticed something strange. The bottom drawer wouldn't close all the way. "That's odd." I emptied it completely. Nothing looked unusual. Still, the drawer felt heavier than it should. I ran my fingers along the inside edge. There was a tiny gap, a false bottom. My heartbeat quickened. No, Margaret loved little hiding places, birthday presents, anniversary cards. She once hid my Christmas gift inside the freezer because she knew I'd never look there. "You're unbelievable," I'd laughed. "I know you too well," she'd replied. She had, maybe better than I knew myself. I lifted the wooden panel. Underneath lay a single folded piece of paper. Nothing else. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't a letter, just one sentence. "Tom, if you've reached this point, take the key from my blue cookie tin. You'll know which one." I frowned. The blue cookie tin? We had dozens over the years. Then I remembered. The old tin in the pantry. She never kept cookies inside it. Only recipes, or so I thought. I hurried downstairs. The blue tin sat exactly where it always had. Inside were recipe cards, cinnamon rolls, chicken soup, apple pie. Beneath them, a small brass key taped to the bottom. My pulse raced. Attached to the key was another note. "Safety Deposit Box 214. Maple County Bank." I stared at it. We had a safety deposit box? I honestly couldn't remember. Or maybe I had simply forgotten. The phone rang before I could think any further. "David," I answered. "Morning. Hi, Dad. You don't usually call this early. I was checking on you. I'm still alive." I figured. His laugh sounded forced. "You feeling okay? I've been cleaning." "The attic?" Mostly there was a pause. "You find anything interesting?" The question caught me off guard. As a matter of fact, I hesitated. "I found one of your mother's old cassette tapes." Silence, not the ordinary kind, the uncomfortable kind. When David finally spoke, his voice sounded different. "What kind of tape?" "I haven't finished listening to it." Another pause. "Dad, yes?" "I think you should throw it away." I blinked. "What?" "Just leave the past alone." "It isn't that simple." "It should be." His tone had become strangely sharp. "I don't understand. Some things don't need to be dug back up." "Why would you say that?" "I just think it's healthier." "For who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did Mom say anything unusual?" The question settled heavily between us. "Why are you asking that?" "No reason. There must be a reason. I have to go." David, the line went dead. I stared at the phone. David hated talking about his mother's death. But this wasn't grief. It sounded like fear. That afternoon, Emily stopped by with homemade soup. She took one look at my face. "You found something else." "How do you know?" "You've got your detective face." "My what?" "The same face you make when you're trying to solve one of your history puzzles." I laughed despite myself. "You always notice too much. I already told you that." As we sat in the kitchen, my phone buzzed again. "David," I answered on speaker without thinking. "Dad." "Yes?" I meant what I said. "About what?" "The cassette." Emily looked up immediately. David continued. Whatever Mom left, don't keep chasing it. You haven't even asked what was on it. I don't need to. How could you possibly know that? Another silence. Then I just do. The call ended. Emily slowly looked at me. Grandpa, what? That was weird. I know. No, she shook her head. That wasn't just weird. He sounded upset. He sounded scared. The word lingered. Scared, Emily leaned forward. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did Uncle David know about the tape before you found it? I don't think so. You're not sure? No, she folded her arms. What exactly did Grandma say? I hesitated. Then I repeated every word I could remember. Emily listened carefully. When I finished, she stayed quiet for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. If the tape really stopped because it was damaged, yes? Then your uncle's reaction doesn't make any sense. What are you thinking? She lowered her voice. I think Grandma wasn't the only person who knew that tape existed. The room suddenly felt colder. I looked toward the study where the cassette still rested inside the player. For 15 years, I'd believed Margaret took every secret she ever had to the grave. Now I wasn't so sure. What frightened me even more was realizing I had started questioning memories I'd trusted for 60 years. Not because I doubted Margaret. Because I was beginning to wonder if she'd spent the last years of her life protecting someone. And every answer she left behind seemed determined to ask me an even bigger question. Emily arrived before sunrise carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me without saying a word. You didn't sleep either? I asked. She shook her head. I kept thinking about Uncle David. So did I. He wasn't acting like someone who was protecting a memory. What do you think he was protecting? She looked out the windshield before answering. I think he already knows part of Grandma's secret. The drive to Maple County Bank was quiet. Every mile seemed to make the brass key in my pocket feel heavier. When we finally stepped inside, the lobby looked exactly as I remembered it from years ago. The young receptionist smiled politely. Good morning. How may I help you? I placed the key on the counter. I believe my wife and I rented a safety deposit box here many years ago. She examined the key before typing on her computer. A few seconds later, her expression changed. Yes, Mr. Walker, my heart skipped. It still exists? It does. Emily looked at me in surprise. I honestly thought it would have been closed years ago. So did I admitted. The receptionist stood. Our manager will assist you. A gray-haired gentleman introduced himself and led us through a secured hallway. I'll need both keys, he explained. He inserted one, I inserted the other. The lock clicked. There you are. He carefully removed a long metal box and placed it on a private table. Take all the time you need. As the door closed behind him, neither Emily nor I moved. You open it, she whispered. My hands are shaking. So are mine. I slowly lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a stack of old family photographs tied with a faded ribbon. I picked up the top picture. Margaret and I were dancing in our kitchen. Flour covered both our faces. Emily smiled. I've never seen this one. Neither have I. The next photograph showed David at 12 years old holding a fishing pole almost taller than he was. Then another. Margaret hugging Emily on her first day of kindergarten. Why would Grandma lock these away? Emily asked softly. I don't know. Under the photographs rested a thick envelope filled with legal papers. I glanced through the first few pages. Property records, insurance documents, a copy of an old will. Nothing immediately explained why they had been hidden. Then my fingers touched something plastic. I froze. Another cassette, gray, almost identical to the first one. Only this one carried a different handwritten label. After you've heard the first. Emily inhaled sharply. She planned this. I nodded slowly. This wasn't an accident. Beneath the cassette lay 4 unopened envelopes. Each one was addressed in Margaret's familiar handwriting. For Tom. I reached for the first envelope. Ready? Emily asked. No. I opened it anyway. Inside was a single folded page. The first sentence stole the breath from my lungs. Tom, I'm sorry. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Please don't judge anyone until you've heard everything I have to say. The truth is much larger than one mistake and much older than one decision. If you're reading this, it means I ran out of time before I found the courage to tell you myself. That was it. No explanation, no names, no clue. Emily looked at me. What does she mean? I slowly folded the letter. I wish I knew. Before either of us could say another word, my phone began vibrating across the table. The screen displayed one name, David. I stared at David's name for a second before answering. Morning, son. His voice came quickly. Dad, where are you? At Maple County Bank. There was nothing but silence. Then he asked quietly, You found it, didn't you? My grip tightened around the phone. How did you know there was a safety deposit box? Another long pause. I just knew. No, David. That's not an answer. Emily watched me carefully, saying nothing. I continued. Your mother never mentioned this box to me after she got sick. So tell me something. How do you know about it? His breathing became uneven. Dad, please listen to me. I am listening. Close the box. I frowned. What? Put everything back inside. We just opened it. Then close it. I looked down at the photographs, the letters, and the second cassette. I can't. Yes, you can. No, David. Your mother left these things for me. His voice suddenly rose. She never wanted this. The words echoed inside the small room. I answered slowly. That's strange. What is? Because every single envelope has my name on it. He didn't reply. I picked up the letter again. She even wrote that she ran out of time. Dad, she wanted me to know something. No, his voice cracked. She wanted you to remember her, not chase ghosts. I've already heard the first tape. The silence that followed told me everything. He knew. Not every detail, but enough. You've heard it before, haven't you? I asked. You have. I can't talk about this. Why? Because talking about it won't change anything. It might change everything. Emily leaned closer, trying to hear every word. David lowered his voice. Please destroy the tapes. Why? They'll only hurt people. Who? No answer. David, I can't. You can't, or you won't? He whispered something I almost missed. I'm trying to protect this family. The call ended. I slowly lowered the phone onto the table. Emily finally spoke. He knows. I think so. No, she shook her head. I think he knows a lot more than he's admitting. I looked back inside the deposit box. The second cassette seemed to be staring back at me. What kind of secret makes a grown man beg his own father to destroy his mother's final words? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the stack of legal papers. Can I look through these? Of course. She carefully spread them across the table. Several were property deeds. Others were insurance documents. Then she stopped. Grandpa, what? Look at this. She pointed toward a date. This paperwork is from 22 years ago. I frowned. That can't be right. It is. She pulled out another document. And here's another. Same year? She nodded. Whatever Grandma was preparing for, she looked into my eyes. It started decades before she got sick. A cold feeling settled over me. For 15 years, I'd believed cancer had stolen the chance for Margaret to tell me whatever was on those tapes. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe she'd been carrying this secret long before she ever walked into a hospital. We packed everything carefully into a small bag and left the bank. Halfway home, Emily broke the silence. Grandpa, yes? I don't think this is about money. I don't either. I don't even think it's about inheritance. What are you thinking? She stared out the passenger window. I think it's about someone. Someone? She nodded. People don't hide photographs, letters, recordings, and legal papers for 20 years unless they're protecting a person. Her words lingered in the truck. Protecting someone. Margaret had always protected people, sometimes even from themselves. Could she really have carried a burden that long? When we reached the house, I placed everything on the dining room table. The second cassette rested beside the first one. 2 recordings, 4 unopened letters, dozens of photographs, and questions that refused to stop multiplying. Emily picked up one of the old photographs again. Grandpa, I looked over. She pointed toward the background. Who's that man? I took the picture from her. It showed Margaret smiling at a summer picnic. David was a little boy, running across the grass. But standing behind them, half hidden by an old maple tree, was a man I didn't recognize. Yet something about his face felt strangely familiar. There was no name, no date, no explanation. Only one unsettling realization. Somehow, he had been standing beside my family years before I ever noticed he existed. And for the first time since finding Margaret's tapes, I began to wonder whether the biggest secret wasn't hidden inside the recordings at all. Maybe it had been quietly hiding in our family photographs, waiting for someone to finally look beyond the people we already knew. I couldn't stop looking at the man in the photograph. He wasn't standing close to my family. He wasn't smiling for the camera. It was almost as if he hadn't wanted to be seen at all. Emily leaned over my shoulder. Do you recognize him now? I slowly shook my head. No, but something about him feels familiar. She picked up the second cassette. Maybe Grandma does. I looked at the tape for a long moment before nodding. Let's find out. A few minutes later, we sat in the living room with the cassette player between us. Neither of us spoke. I pressed play. Static crackled through the speaker. Then Margaret's voice returned. Hello again, my stubborn husband. A tear escaped before I could stop it. Emily smiled faintly. She knew you well. Margaret laughed softly on the recording. If you're hearing this, then I know exactly what you've been doing. I whispered, probably. You've searched the house, opened drawers I told you never to touch, and convinced yourself every little clue has a meaning. Emily chuckled. She really did know you. Then Margaret's tone became gentler. Tom, before I tell you anything else, I need you to promise me one thing. I leaned closer. Please don't decide who was right or wrong until you've heard everything. The room fell silent except for her voice. Life isn't divided into heroes and villains. Sometimes the people who hurt us are the same people trying hardest to protect us. I exchanged a puzzled look with Emily. Protect us? From what? Margaret continued. 22 years ago, I learned something that changed the way I looked at our family forever. My heart began pounding. 22 years. The same date we had seen on the legal papers. I wanted to tell you that very night, she said. I even wrote the words down. A brief pause. But before I could, someone I loved asked me to make a promise. Emily whispered. Someone asked her to stay quiet. I nodded without taking my eyes off the cassette player. Margaret's voice trembled for the first time. It was the hardest promise I've ever made. Another pause. I've asked myself 1,000 times whether keeping it was the right thing to do. I could almost picture her sitting alone, recording those words. I wasn't protecting a lie. She took a slow breath. I was protecting a person. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide. The man in the photograph? I don't know. Margaret continued before either of us could speak again. Every family carries invisible scars. Some heal, some never do. And sometimes, love means carrying a burden so the people you love don't have to. I felt my throat tighten. For 15 years I'd convinced myself Margaret had never hidden anything from me. Now I was listening to her admit she'd carried a secret for more than 2 decades. I need you to understand something, Tom. Her voice sounded almost pleading. This isn't a story about betrayal. I closed my eyes. It's about sacrifice. The word echoed through the room. Sacrifice, not betrayal. Everything I'd imagined over the past few days suddenly felt wrong. Maybe Margaret hadn't been hiding another life. Maybe she'd been protecting ours. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. The day I discovered the truth, I realized someone in this family would eventually blame themselves. I whispered. Who? There was no answer, only the soft hiss of the cassette continuing to turn. Emily slowly reached for my hand. Neither of us noticed we'd been holding our breath. Margaret's voice returned, softer than before. If you're still listening, thank you. I leaned closer to the cassette player. I know you're searching for one moment, one mistake, one person to blame. That's who you are, Tom. You always believed every problem had an answer if you looked hard enough. I let out a quiet sigh. She wasn't wrong. Emily smiled, but neither of us looked away from the tape. Margaret continued. The truth is much heavier than that. It wasn't one decision that changed our lives. It was many small decisions, made by people who loved each other and were terrified of losing one another. She paused. I've spent years asking God whether I did the right thing. The room felt impossibly still. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner, I carried the same question in my heart. I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" Almost as if she had heard me, Margaret answered. Because if I had told you then, your first instinct would have been to fix it. Emily looked at me. Would you have? I didn't hesitate. Yes, she nodded. I know. Margaret's voice grew steadier. But some things can't be fixed. They can only be carried. A lump formed in my throat. The person who asked me to keep this promise wasn't selfish. She paused again. They were frightened. I exchanged another glance with Emily. The mystery was growing, not shrinking. That person believed the truth would destroy this family forever. My hands tightened around the arm of the chair. Were they right? The tape rolled on. I never agreed with their fear, but I understood it. Another crackle. Tom, if you're angry with me, I understand. I shook my head. I'm not angry. I'm sorry I let you carry guilt that was never entirely yours. Those words hit me harder than anything she'd said before. Emily looked at me. Grandpa, I couldn't answer. For 15 years, I'd blamed myself for not catching Margaret's illness sooner. I'd replayed every doctor's appointment, every complaint she brushed aside. Every night I convinced myself I should have noticed something sooner. Had she known that all along? Margaret continued gently. You loved me with everything you had. A tear slipped down my cheek. You gave me a beautiful life. Another pause, and that is why I couldn't bear to watch you punish yourself. I whispered, then why? Why let me believe it? The cassette hissed softly. There will come a day when someone tells you the rest. Emily frowned. Someone? I pray that when that day comes, you'll listen before you judge. A sudden click echoed through the player. I stared at it. No, the recording hadn't ended. It continued. There are letters I never had the courage to give you. I immediately looked toward the unopened envelopes on the table. Margaret was talking about them. When you've read them all, her voice trembled. You'll finally understand why I kept my promise. The tape slowed for just a second before returning to normal. "I don't know whether you'll forgive me," I whispered through tears. "I already do, but I hope you'll forgive yourself." Silence filled the room. Then the cassette reached its end. This time there was no abrupt stop, no missing recording, only the quiet clicking of the empty reel turning inside the player. Neither Emily nor I spoke for almost a minute. Finally, she broke the silence. "This isn't about an affair. No, it isn't about money either." I slowly shook my head. "It's about a promise. And whoever made Grandma keep it." I looked at the 4 unopened letters. Each one suddenly felt more important than the tapes themselves. Emily stood and picked up the photograph of the mysterious man. "Do you know what I keep thinking?" "What?" "I don't think this man is the secret." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think he's the key." Those words settled heavily in my mind. The tapes had answered one question. Margaret hadn't betrayed me. She had sacrificed her own peace to protect someone she loved. But in doing so, she'd left behind an even greater mystery. Who had asked for that promise? Why had David spent years living in fear of it? And why had Margaret believed that one day, someone else not her would finally tell me the rest of the story? As I reached for the first unopened letter, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't shake. Maybe Margaret hadn't left me clues to uncover the past. Maybe she was preparing me for someone who was about to walk back into my life. I stared at the first unopened letter for almost an hour. My fingers rested on the seal, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Emily noticed. "You're waiting for someone." I looked up. "What makes you say that?" "Because Grandma said someone would tell you the rest." She was right. For the first time since finding the tapes, I wasn't waiting for another clue. I was waiting for a person. Almost as if the house had heard her words, a car pulled into the driveway. Emily looked through the window. "It's Uncle David." Neither of us moved. A moment later, there was a knock at the front door. I opened it. David stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked exhausted. "Dad, I wasn't sure you'd come." I almost didn't. Emily quietly picked up the letters. "I'll make some coffee." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving us alone in the living room. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. "You listened to the second tape?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I figured you would." I folded my arms. "How much do you know?" He looked down at the floor. "Enough to lose sleep." "That's not an answer." "No," he sighed. "It isn't." I pointed toward the chair across from me. "Sit down." He obeyed. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me. "Did your mother tell you to keep this secret?" He closed his eyes. Yes, the answer hit me harder than I expected. When? About 3 months before she died. I couldn't hide my surprise. She was already sick. Very, and she chose you? He nodded. I accidentally found one of the tapes. I frowned. You found it? I wasn't supposed to. What happened? David rubbed his hands together. I was helping Mom organize the attic. The attic? She asked me to move some boxes. He looked toward the ceiling as if he could still see that day. One of them fell. The cassette slid across the floor. I picked it up. And? I read the label. I felt my heart sink. The same label? He nodded. For Tom. I asked her what it was. What did she say? David smiled sadly. She took it out of my hands and said, he paused, some conversations belong to the people who lived them. I could almost hear Margaret saying those words. Did you listen to it? He hesitated. Only a few seconds. My voice sharpened. So you lied. I know. You told me you'd never heard it. I panicked. Why? Because I promised her. His eyes filled with tears. She made me swear I would never tell you. I leaned forward. Why would she ask that of you? Because she knew I couldn't lie to you forever. I stared at him. Then why? He finally looked me in the eye. She said the truth would have broken your heart while she was still alive. The room fell silent. David continued quietly. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting you. I shook my head. From what? He swallowed hard. I don't know everything. You expect me to believe that? It's the truth. What exactly did she tell you? He answered almost immediately, only enough to understand why she was making the recordings. And enough to know that someone else was carrying a burden even heavier than hers. I frowned. Who? David slowly shook his head. I don't know. You don't? No, she never told me the name. I studied his face. For the first time in years, I believed him. He wasn't hiding the whole truth. He was carrying only the piece she'd allowed him to know. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. Dad, yes? I think I've been punishing you for something that was never your fault. Those words caught me completely off guard. I looked at my son and realized this conversation was only beginning. I stared at David, waiting for him to continue. He rubbed his hands together, the same nervous habit he'd had since he was a little boy. Dad, after Mom died, every time I came over here I wanted to tell you. What stopped you? He let out a slow breath. Her, I frowned. She wasn't here anymore. I know. He looked toward the window. But I could still hear her voice. What do you mean? The night before she passed away, she asked me to promise one last thing. He swallowed hard. Don't let your father carry my burden until he's strong enough to survive it. The room fell silent. I whispered, she actually said that? David nodded. I asked her why she couldn't just tell you herself. What did she say? His eyes filled with tears. She smiled. I could picture it. Even at the end, Margaret always smiled before saying something difficult. David continued. She said, because if I tell him now, he'll spend whatever time I have left trying to fix something that can't be fixed. I lowered my head. That sounded exactly like Margaret, and exactly like me. I would have tried, I admitted. I know. I would have searched for answers. I know. I would have forgotten to simply sit beside her. David nodded. That's what she was afraid of. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me begin to shift. Maybe Margaret hadn't hidden the truth because she didn't trust me. Maybe she'd hidden it because she knew me too well. David looked at me carefully. Can I tell you something I've never admitted? I nodded. The day we buried Mom, his voice cracked. I blamed you. I looked up. You did? I knew you blamed yourself for not catching her cancer sooner. I still do. I thought if you'd convinced her to see another doctor earlier, he couldn't finish the sentence. So you were angry. He wiped his eyes. I was. I sat quietly. But after a while, he looked at me. I realized you were punishing yourself far more than I ever could. Neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, every time I visited, you looked older. I was. I'd find you sitting on the porch talking to Mom like she was still beside you. I smiled sadly. Sometimes she felt that close. I'd drive home thinking. His voice broke again. If I told you what I knew, maybe I'd destroy the only piece you had left. I reached across the table. For the first time in years, I placed my hand over his. You were carrying this alone. He nodded. I thought your loneliness was partly my fault. It wasn't. I should have been a better son. You were trying to keep a promise. He looked at me through tear-filled eyes. Do you forgive me? I squeezed his hand. There was never anything to forgive. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Years of distance seemed to disappear in that single moment. Emily quietly stepped into the living room carrying fresh coffee. She smiled when she saw us sitting together. "I'll come back." "No," I said. "Stay." She sat beside us. David looked at the stack of letters on the table. "Have you opened those yet?" "Not yet." "Good." Emily frowned. "Why good?" David hesitated. "Because," he looked at me, "I don't think the letters are complete." "What do you mean?" "When I accidentally found the first cassette years ago," he paused, "I also saw another envelope. I immediately looked at the 4 letters. There are only 4. I remember 5. The room fell silent. Emily leaned forward. "You're sure?" "I'd bet my life on it." A chill ran through me. 5 letters, I whispered. "But only 4 are here." David nodded slowly. "And I remember something else." "What?" "The first cassette wasn't damaged." I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "The day I found it," he closed his eyes, trying to remember. "I picked it up by mistake." "And?" I pressed play for just a second. My heart started racing. It didn't stop where yours stopped. I stood so quickly my chair nearly fell over. "What did you just say?" "I heard more than you did." Emily looked from him to me. "Then why didn't Grandpa hear it?" David's face turned pale. "Because," he swallowed hard. The recording kept going. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. "Are you saying someone erased part of it?" "I don't know. But I know this." He looked directly at me. "The tape I heard 15 years ago wasn't missing its ending." The room went completely still. I slowly picked up the first cassette from the table. For days I'd believed time had damaged it. Now another possibility stood before me. Someone had listened to Margaret's final message after she recorded it. Someone had removed the most important part. Someone had carefully placed the tape back where I would eventually find it. Emily spoke the thought none of us wanted to say aloud. If someone erased the ending, she looked at the missing 5th letter. Then whoever did it knew exactly what Grandma was trying to tell you. I looked at the cassette in my hands. The mystery had changed again. I was no longer searching for a family secret. I was searching for the person who had been afraid of the truth, even after Margaret was gone. The house felt different after David left. Not quieter. Heavier. I kept staring at the first cassette, wondering how many hands had touched it before it reached mine. Emily finally broke the silence. "I'm not giving up." I looked at her. "On what?" "The missing recording. It might be impossible to recover." She smiled the same stubborn smile Margaret used to wear. "Grandma didn't raise quitters." I laughed. "No, she certainly didn't." Emily picked up the cassette carefully. "I know a man in Burlington." "You do?" "He restores old recordings for museums and local radio stations." "You think he can help?" "I think it's worth asking." I looked at the cassette one last time before handing it to her. "Take care of it." "I will." "And Emily," "Yes?" "If he can't recover anything," she squeezed my hand, "we'll still find the truth." After she drove away, the silence returned. For the first time in days, I didn't reach for another clue. Instead, I reached for my car keys. There was somewhere I needed to go. An hour later, I stood outside the little white church where Margaret and I had been married. The front doors were unlocked. I stepped inside. The old wooden pews hadn't changed, neither had the sunlight spilling through the stained glass windows. I sat in the 3rd row, the same row where my father had wiped tears from his eyes while pretending he wasn't crying. I smiled. "I still remember your dress, Maggie. It had been simple. Nothing expensive. Yet I'd never seen anyone more beautiful. I remember you whispering that my tie was crooked." I laughed quietly. "You fixed it before anyone noticed." My voice echoed through the empty church. "I spent 60 years trying to deserve you." For the first time, that thought didn't make me feel guilty, only grateful. When I left the church, I drove to the lake. The old wooden bench was still there. Its paint had faded, but it overlooked the same quiet water. I sat down. 40 years earlier, Margaret had looked at me from this very spot and said, "So, are you ever going to ask me?" I'd stared at her. "Ask you what?" She laughed. "The question you've been carrying around for 6 months." I'd pulled a small ring from my pocket. I was waiting for the perfect moment. She'd smiled. "This is the perfect moment." I closed my eyes. I should have brought flowers. "You brought yourself," she'd answered. That was enough. I opened my eyes. For years, every memory had ended with loss. Now, they were beginning to end with love instead. By late afternoon, I found myself parked outside the nursing home, the place I'd avoided for 15 years. I almost drove away. Instead, I walked inside. A young nurse greeted me. "Can I help you?" "My wife passed away here." She offered a gentle smile. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to sit for a while." She pointed toward the small garden. I sat alone beneath an old maple tree. The last afternoon Margaret and I spent together came rushing back. She'd held my hand. "Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, I don't want to talk about that. You have to." I'd shaken my head. "No," she smiled. "You'll keep living. I won't know how. You will. Not without you. You'll learn." A tear rolled down my cheek. I finally am. For the first time since she died, I believed those words. As the sun began to set, my phone rang. "Emily, Grandpa? You sound excited. I think I found something." My heart skipped. "The recording? Not yet." "What then?" The restoration specialist noticed something unusual. I stood. "What is it?" "He says your cassette isn't the original." I froze. "What? It was copied. When?" "He isn't certain. But he says the magnetic pattern is consistent with an older master recording." I struggled to understand. "So, the tape I found was made from another tape." "Exactly." I leaned against the garden fence. "Then where's the original?" "That's the question." She hesitated. "And there's one more thing." "What?" "The missing ending wasn't erased from this cassette." My pulse quickened. It was already missing before this copy was made. I closed my eyes. Someone hadn't destroyed the ending after Margaret died. Someone had removed it before this cassette was ever placed inside the attic. That meant there had once been an original recording. Someone had copied it. Someone had kept the original. And someone had decided that the final minutes were never meant to reach me. As I looked up at the evening sky, one thought refused to leave my mind. Even after her death, Margaret was still protecting someone. The question was no longer whether she had a secret. The question was whether she had ever intended for me to hear the whole truth at all. Emily called before breakfast. "Grandpa, it's ready." I was already reaching for my coat. "The recording?" "Yes." "Did he recover it?" "He recovered something." Her hesitation stayed with me the entire drive. When I arrived, the audio restoration specialist was waiting beside a small set of speakers. He greeted me with a kind smile. "I wish I had better news." "So there isn't much?" "There was more than before." Emily looked at me. "But not everything." I nodded. "That's better than yesterday." The specialist placed the cassette on the table. I cleaned the noise as much as I could. "Will we hear the missing part?" He sighed. "I honestly don't know." No one spoke. He pressed play. The familiar crackle filled the room. Margaret's voice returned, warm, gentle, as though no time had passed at all. "Tom." The restored section began exactly where the original recording had ended. "There is one thing I need you to understand before you learn anything else." I closed my eyes. "I'm listening." "You've spent so many years blaming yourself." My throat tightened. "I watched you apologize to me for things that were never yours to carry." Emily quietly reached for my hand. Margaret continued. You believed you failed me. A tear rolled down my cheek. No, my illness wasn't your fault. Her voice remained calm. It wasn't because you missed a symptom. It wasn't because you trusted the doctors. It wasn't because you loved me too little. I whispered, then why did you let me believe it? Almost as if she'd heard me, she answered. Because if I had told you the truth while I was alive, she paused. Someone else would have carried a burden even heavier than yours. The room became perfectly still. I couldn't do that. Emily looked at me. So that's what she meant. I nodded slowly. Margaret wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting another heart. Not from blame, but from unbearable guilt. Her voice softened. I made a choice. Right or wrong, it was mine. I chose to carry the weight because I believed I was strong enough. A long pause followed. I don't know if I was. I lowered my head. For the first time, I realized Margaret had been lonely in a way I had never seen. She had smiled through family dinners. She had laughed with Emily. She had held my hand. All while carrying a secret that belonged to no one alone. Every family has invisible scars. She gave a quiet laugh. Some are inherited, some are created, and some are accepted willingly. Emily whispered. She sacrificed herself. I answered softly, yes, Margaret continued. Tom, if there's one thing I hope you remember, it's this. Forgiveness isn't something another person gives you. It's something you choose for yourself. I closed my eyes. For 15 years, I'd waited for someone to tell me I wasn't responsible. Instead, Margaret was asking me to stop waiting. She wanted me to forgive myself, not because someone else had declared me innocent, but because love was never meant to become a life sentence. The recording continued. I know you'll search for every missing answer. A faint smile crossed my face. You always do. But not every question needs to be solved before a heart can heal. I looked at Emily. She smiled through tears. That sounds exactly like Grandma. It does. Margaret took one slow breath. There is one last thing I have to tell you. My heart began pounding. This is it, I whispered. The truth about, her voice faltered. A burst of static interrupted the recording. The specialist immediately reached for the controls. No, Margaret's voice returned for only a fraction of a second. The person who, static swallowed the words. The tape hissed. Another broken fragment escaped. Never wanted you. More static. Then silence. The reel reached its end. Nobody moved. The specialist slowly removed the cassette. I'm sorry. That's everything I could recover. I stared at the empty player. The sentence, he nodded sadly. It's gone. Emily looked at me. Do you think it was damaged? I thought about David. The missing fifth letter. The copied cassette. The original recording that had disappeared. Then I remembered something Margaret had once told me. Not every silence is empty. I smiled faintly. I honestly don't know. Maybe time had stolen her final words. Maybe someone had. But as we walked toward the door, I realized something surprising. For the first time since finding that dusty cassette in the attic, I wasn't chasing the missing sentence. Because Margaret had already given me the part I needed most. She hadn't asked me to solve her secret. She had asked me to set down my own. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of an answer. Even if the final words of her story would remain forever unfinished. 6 months passed. For the first time in 15 years, I stopped measuring my life by the day Margaret died. Instead, I started measuring it by the mornings I was still lucky enough to wake up. One Saturday afternoon, David pulled into the driveway carrying a toolbox. What are you fixing? I asked. He smiled. Whatever you haven't broken yet. I laughed. That's a long list. Emily climbed out of her car behind him with a paper bag in her hands. I brought Grandma's cinnamon rolls. You finally learned the recipe? She grinned. Not exactly. Then what's different? I burned the first batch. David laughed. Now they really taste like Mom's. For the first time in years, the three of us laughed together without forcing it. The silence between us no longer felt like punishment. It felt like healing. A week later, the realtor called. Mr. Walker, are you still planning to list the house? I looked around the kitchen. Margaret's favorite coffee mug still rested beside the window. The old clock still chimed every hour. Outside, the roses she planted were blooming again. I smiled. No, you've changed your mind? I've changed my heart. After hanging up, I walked slowly upstairs. The attic no longer felt like a place filled with ghosts. It felt like a place filled with memories. There was a difference. I opened the old cardboard box one final time. Inside were the photographs, the letters, the faded blue ribbon, and the worn cassette that had changed everything. I picked it up. So, I whispered. We finally listened. The little plastic tape looked ordinary. If someone else found it, they'd probably toss it into the trash without a second thought. They'd never know it carried 60 years of love, 22 years of silence, and one unfinished sentence. I placed the cassette back into the box exactly where I'd found it. Then I laid Margaret's letters beside it. I didn't need to carry them everywhere anymore. I knew their words by heart. As I closed the lid, I realized something that would have seemed impossible only a few months earlier. I no longer needed every answer. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to remind us that love is rarely simple. Every family has stories that never make it into photo albums. Conversations interrupted by time. Apologies spoken too late. Promises kept so faithfully that the reasons behind them disappear. Maybe that's part of growing old. Not collecting answers, but learning which questions can finally be set down. I turned toward the attic stairs. Then I stopped. One question still lingered. What had Margaret been about to say before the tape dissolved into silence? The person who, I smiled to myself. For months, I'd believed those missing words held the key to everything. Now, I wasn't so sure. Perhaps Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. Perhaps she understood that if she finished the sentence, I'd spend the rest of my life chasing one last explanation. Instead, she left me with a choice. To keep searching, or to keep living. I chose to keep living. As I switched off the attic light, the house became perfectly still. Then, somewhere in that beautiful silence, I could almost hear her laugh. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough to make me smile. I never turned around to see if anyone was there. Some voices don't need to be heard to be believed. And some goodbyes aren't meant to end with the last word. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is leaving one sentence unfinished, so the person you leave behind can finish it with the life they choose to live. Maybe the tape was damaged. Maybe someone erased those final moments. Or maybe Margaret's last gift wasn't an answer at all. Maybe it was the quiet courage to let me write the ending for myself. Moral of the story: love is not measured by the secrets we uncover, but by the compassion we choose after discovering them. Some questions may never be fully answered, yet healing begins the moment we stop letting guilt define our lives and learn to forgive ourselves as deeply as we forgive those we love. The end.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more real-life stories.